Cleopatra 7. She is probably the most famous woman in ancient history and the most misunderstood. The story that gets told most often is the romantic one, the one about Caesar and Antony and a woman so beautiful empires bent toward her. The truth is considerably more interesting. Cleopatra was a politician operating in an environment where one wrong move meant losing everything, and every relationship she entered was calculated to prevent exactly that. Egypt was wealthy but vulnerable, sitting at the edge of a Rome that was consuming the ancient world one kingdom at a time. She needed powerful Roman allies not because she was swept away by feeling, but because without them, Egypt would be absorbed the way every other kingdom around her had been. Julius Caesar was the most powerful man alive when she aligned with him. When he died, she moved toward Mark Antony, the next most significant Roman force. Neither of these were accidents of the heart. They were decisions made by someone who understood geopolitics better than most of the men she was negotiating with. When Antony's position collapsed and Octavian's victory became inevitable, she chose death over being paraded through Rome as a trophy. Even her ending was a refusal to let someone else control her narrative. She was 39 years old. Isabella I of Castile. She married Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 when she was 18 years old, and the marriage was arranged in secret, partly because her brother, the King of Castile, would have blocked it if he had known. That detail alone tells you something about how she operated. The union between Isabella and Ferdinand was not a love match in the traditional sense. It was a merger, two crowns joining forces to create something neither could build alone. Together, they unified Spain, expelled the Moors from Granada, launched the Spanish Inquisition, and sent Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic. She handled Castile. Ferdinand handled Aragon. They governed their respective kingdoms separately while presenting a united front to the world. She was not subordinate to him, and she never pretended to be. When decisions needed making, she made them, including some of the most consequential and brutal decisions of the 15th century. The Inquisition she authorized caused immense suffering. The expulsion of Jewish people from Spain in 1492 displaced hundreds of thousands. She believed she was building a unified Christian nation, and she pursued that vision without hesitation. The marriage that made it possible was strategic from the first conversation. Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was the most powerful woman in 12th century Europe, and she was married twice, both times to kings, and both times the marriage was inseparable from politics. Her first husband was Louis VII of France, and she accompanied him on the Second Crusade, which did not go well and which strained their relationship beyond repair. The marriage was annulled in 1152, officially on grounds of consanguinity, and within 2 months she had married Henry II of England. The speed of that remarriage was not impulsive. Eleanor had almost certainly been in negotiation before the annulment was finalized, because a woman controlling the Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most strategically significant territories in Europe, could not afford to be unmarried for long. Her lands would become someone else's target the moment she was unattached. Henry was a logical choice and an ambitious one, because joining Aquitaine to the English crown created a territorial holding that rivaled France itself. The marriage eventually became a war. Eleanor supported her sons when they rebelled against Henry, and he imprisoned her for 16 years in response. She outlived him, was released, and spent her final years governing and traveling with an energy that suggested the imprisonment had not broken anything essential in her. Marie Antoinette. She was 14 years old when the negotiations for her marriage to the French Dauphin were finalized, and she had very little say in any of it. She was an Austrian archduchess, the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, and her marriage to the future Louis XVI was designed to cement an alliance between Austria and France that both countries needed. She crossed the border into France in 1770 in a ceremony that required her to leave behind everything Austrian, her clothes, her pets, her attendants, symbolically shedding her old identity to become French property. The marriage itself was famously unconsummated for several years, a fact that was widely known and that added public humiliation to an already isolated situation. She was unprepared for the French court, unused to the particular cruelty of Versailles gossip, and surrounded by people who had no interest in helping her succeed. She responded by spending, by creating a world within the palace that she could actually control, and the image of extravagance that followed her was partly real and partly a portrait painted by people who needed a villain. When the revolution came, she was 37. She was executed in 1793. The alliance her marriage was supposed to protect had long since collapsed into irrelevance. Mary I of England. She was betrothed and unbetrothed multiple times before she finally married at the age of 38, and by that point, the political calculation involved was impossible to separate from her personal desperation for an heir. Her husband was Philip II of Spain, 11 years younger than her, and he had no particular warmth toward her beyond what the alliance required. The marriage joined England to the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe, which was the point. Mary was determined to return England to Rome after the Protestant reforms of her father Henry VIII and her brother Edward VI, and a Spanish alliance gave that project military and political backing. Philip was in England for just over a year before returning to Spain and his other responsibilities. He came back briefly when England's support for his wars was needed. The marriage produced no children, despite Mary's desperate hope that it would, and the phantom pregnancy she experienced, whether psychological or medical in origin, are among the saddest details in Tudor history. She died in 1558, believing herself a failure. The Protestant England she had tried to dismantle outlasted her by centuries. Elizabeth of York. She married Henry VIII in 1486, and the marriage was the foundation on which everything that followed in English history was built, because it ended the Wars of the Roses. Elizabeth was a Yorkist princess, Henry was a Lancastrian claimant, and their union symbolically joined the two houses that had been at war for decades. The White Rose and the Red Rose, becoming the Tudor Rose, was not just a pretty image, it was a political statement designed to tell England that the conflict was over and that the new dynasty represented both sides of the wound. Elizabeth herself left fewer records than almost any other queen of her era, partly because she seems to have understood that her role was to legitimate the dynasty quietly rather than assert herself loudly. What is clear is that she was well educated, genuinely respected within the court, and that Henry VIII, a man not known for emotional warmth, appears to have been genuinely attached to her. She died in 1503 after giving birth to her 8th child. Henry's grief at her death was documented and appeared real, which is notable for a king whose relationship to feeling was generally kept at a considerable distance from public view. Roxolana. She was enslaved and brought to the Ottoman imperial harem as a young woman, likely from what is now Ukraine, and what she built from that position is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of power. She attracted the attention of Suleiman the Magnificent and then kept it, which was the more difficult of the two achievements in an environment designed to rotate the Sultan's interest across many women. She made herself indispensable, intellectually and politically, corresponding with foreign dignitaries, offering counsel, building relationships within the court that extended her influence far beyond the harem walls. When Suleiman freed her and then married her, he broke with Ottoman tradition in ways that generated significant opposition. Sultans did not marry their concubines. The fact that he did it anyway said everything about the position she had built. From that platform, she worked to secure the succession for her sons, and the obstacles that stood between them and the throne were removed with a thoroughness that suggested careful planning over a long period. Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's closest friend and most powerful minister, was executed. Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa, popular and capable, was strangled on his father's orders following accusations shaped almost certainly by Roxolana's influence. Her son Salem eventually became sultan. She had begun with nothing and ended having redirected the most powerful empire in the world. Catherine of Aragon. She arrived in England in 1501 as the bride of Arthur, Prince of Wales, and within months, he was dead. What followed was years of uncertainty, poverty, and diplomatic limbo while England and Spain negotiated over what to do with the Spanish princess who was no longer attached to an English heir. She eventually married Arthur's younger brother, the future Henry VIII, in 1509. The marriage lasted 24 years and produced one surviving child, Mary. Henry's desire for a male heir combined with his attraction to Anne Boleyn eventually became the engine of the English Reformation because the only way to end the marriage was to deny the authority of the Pope, who refused to annul it. Catherine refused to accept the annulment, refused to be set aside quietly, and maintained until her death that she was the rightful Queen of England. Her stubbornness was not simply personal pride, though it was partly that too. It was a position with significant theological and political weight, supported by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose influence over Rome made the Pope's position considerably more complicated than it would otherwise have been. She died in 1536 in a cold, damp castle, stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, still insisting on who she was. The marriage that had brought her to England as a teenager had been strategic. The way she defended it at the end had moved into something else entirely, something that looked, by then, very much like conviction. Stay fascinated by the alliances they built from altar steps. Stay curious about the women who turned marriage into the most powerful weapon in the room, as we keep her files classified.